Greetings gamers, today we're going to get you ready for your next RPG campaign by talking about the Campaign Preface. The Campaign Preface is a document that you want to send to your players as long as possible before your actual game starts. It's a manifesto of sorts that lays out exactly what kind of campaign you're going to run and answers some key questions that your players might have. But why do you need one anyway? I mean, a lot of people start their games without one and get along just fine. Well, you don't need one, but I find them really helpful for managing player expectations and letting everyone get on the same page about the kind of game that you're all going to be playing together. No two DMs run the game exactly the same, and people often come to the table with certain preconceptions or ideas in their head about how the game should be based on games they've played in the past or based on games they've watched being played. Something that you might have noticed in recent years is players saying something to the effect of, "Oh, that's not how they do it on Critical Role," or "I think it should be this way," or "Matt Mercer does it this way." Having a campaign preface makes it very clear the kind of game that you're going to be running and what your players should expect. So, what kind of things should you include in a campaign preface? What do you want to include in there to get your players up to speed and to help manage those expectations? Well, I start mine off with the golden rule. I make it very clear that everyone is at the table to have fun, and having fun is the most important part of us all getting together and playing. I like to remind players that what their characters do can impact other player characters and other players personally, and they should think about everyone else at the table before they act. And I also make it very clear that this is a group activity, and if one player is negatively affecting everyone, then discussions will be had. Next, I talk a little bit about the Dungeon Master's role. This is primarily for new players, but it also helps for some older players as well, to just reinforce that you as the Dungeon Master aren't the enemy of the players. You're there to facilitate their fun. You're not their opponent, you're helping them to tell this story. Next, I touch on player compatibility. Not everyone enjoys every style of game the same, and it's important to make it very clear right at the start what kind of game that you're going to be playing. You might have a player whose main love of the game is the hack and slash, the clearing of rooms, the mechanical side of the game, and they don't really care for roleplay. Well, if you're going to be running a really roleplay heavy game, that player might not enjoy it as much and might ultimately decide that it's not for them. And that is okay. Not every game is for everyone. But it's important right at the start to set those expectations so that people know what they're getting into, and so that if people don't enjoy it down the line because it's not the kind of game that they like, there's no bad blood when players decide to leave or you change directions. I also like to talk about the setting in a more general sense, about whether it's high or low fantasy, how much magic there's going to be, whether there's going to be a lot of magic items and availability of magic items. And I also talk about the power level of the game, whether we're going to be running a high-powered campaign where the players are playing as legendary heroes and have stats to match, or whether we're going to be playing a more average adventure game where the stats are a little bit lower and the players have to earn that legendary feeling. I ask the group if they're happy with the conditions set out in the setting, and if they're not, then we as a group will talk about what we want and tweak and change from there. The next thing I do is talk about characters, and I make it very clear from the start that it's the player's responsibility to know their character rules. The Dungeon Master already has to know way too many rules for any given session, and having to tell your players what their characters can and can't do is just a burden that we don't need. So right from the start, I make it very clear to the players, it is your responsibility to learn the rules for your character. If you forget an ability that you have, that is your fault. If you don't know what your attack rolls are after we've been playing for 6 weeks, we'll skip over your turn and come back to you. It's important that they take the time to learn their character, seeing as though you're taking the time to craft this world for them to play around in. I also make it clear that during character creation, I will go through the character building process with any player that wants it, give them tips and advice, and whether or not their character concepts will work in the setting that we've all agreed upon. I also touch on alignment in my campaign preface. I like to run games where the players are playing heroes, which means I don't really want there to be any chaotic assholes who are super selfish and do really dickish things because it's what their character would do. I make it clear that they're all part of a team. They don't necessarily need to all know each other before the game starts, but they are on a team. They need to work together, and they need to, on the whole, be good. They don't all have to be lawful good goody two-shoes about it, but they shouldn't be burning down orphanages. Another section I include is on encounters and combat. This is primarily for newer players who are coming to the game and their only experience of role-playing games might be in video games, and so they, whether they know it or not, they sort of expect enemies to behave how they do in video games, doing a pre-scripted number of actions and not really deviating from that at all. In the encounter and combat section, I make it clear that the enemies that they're facing are likely intelligent enough to adapt, and that they won't just stand there in a line for you to kill. They'll use cover, they'll flank for bonuses, they'll use the environment around them to their advantage, they'll call for reinforcements, they'll flee. They won't just stand there in a meat grinder every single time. And then following on from that, I have a section on role-playing. Not everyone is comfortable with role-playing as their character in the first person, and I lay out how much roleplay I expect there to be in the game and what I'd like from the players. Typically, I try and go for a 50-50 balance of roleplay and combat, and I like the players to get as involved in that roleplay as possible, but don't penalise them if they're not always in character or if they struggle to perform in their roleplay. One of the most important things that I like to touch on in the campaign preface is scheduling. Time and time again, I've heard from other dungeon masters and players who've had their campaigns wither and die. The biggest reason seems to be scheduling and not being able to get everyone together. So where possible, I really recommend that you set one day a week, one day every 2 weeks, or one day a month, a set day to play, and that you don't arrange it every session. Arranging a session on the fly week by week is going to result in a lot more missed sessions because not everyone can get together on that day. It's going to result in people going for weeks and weeks without playing and then forgetting what you've been doing. And I think that it brings about campaign death quicker than just about anything else. My group meet every Thursday at about 9 p.m. and we play until midnight, 12:30. And we've done so for 49 of the last 52 weeks. There's only been 2 weeks that we haven't played, and both of those have been because I've not been there. I make it very clear that that is the day that we're going to be playing. It's the only day of the week that we will play, and if you're not there, that's your responsibility. As long as at least half of the players are present, we run. And the people that aren't present will miss out on loot. They'll miss out on some, but not all XP, because I don't want to cripple people's characters because they had prior engagements. And obviously, they have to be brought up to speed on the story from the other players. I get my players to do a recap of the previous session every week, partly to fill people in that weren't there, partly to refresh their memory, and partly so that I can get a gauge of what they took away from the previous session and what they missed. And the last major thing that I cover in my campaign preface is death. If you run a game where death is a minor inconvenience and players can be resurrected easily, then you want to talk about that here. Similarly, if you run a game where death is a constant and real threat, and once you die, you're dead, you also want to talk about that here. You want to let the players know what death will mean for them in your campaign. Depending on their experience level, a lot of players will know that death isn't really that much of an inconvenience as you get to the higher levels, because there's powerful magic that can resurrect you. So if you don't have that and your game is one in which death is much more permanent, you need to make that clear so everyone is on the same page. For example, in my campaign, all the resurrection style spells don't work how they do in the written rules. They are much more like rituals in my campaign, where the party will astral project their souls into the soul realm and they will retrieve the dead person themselves. And that in itself has dangers, and they could die from doing so. And even if they are able to retrieve the soul, there's no guarantee that the character that has died will come back whole. So death is much more of a threat in my game than it is in some settings. So there you have it. There's a quick little talk about a campaign preface. I know it's a lot to cover, and it might seem daunting both to write a campaign preface and for your players to have to read through it. But I really think that taking the time to craft this document will save you a lot of headaches in the future, because it will make sure that everyone is on the same page. If you're interested, I've put a link in the description below to my campaign preface that I sent out to my players over a year ago, way back before we started our current campaign. And if you have anything that you think is important to go in the campaign preface that I've missed, post it down in the comments below and let me know whether or not that this is something you would use before your campaigns. But until next time, happy gaming. Thanks for watching. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button down below for new content every single Friday. And if you want to keep watching, well, there's another couple videos for you to watch just over there. Happy gaming.